And this morning. Okay, yes.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming so early in the morning. And if you're watching online as well, thank you for joining us. I'm here today with an amazing group of people. My name is Lorena Yee. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey & Company. I oversee our tech sector, and I'm also our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. I am here with Quaylin Ellengrud, one of our co-authors, Mekhala Krishna, one of our co-authors, and Jen Bovin, who has done an amazing job with a report specifically on Canada and the future of work and women. Today we are so pleased to introduce our new report on the future of work and how it affects women. I'm also seated here next to the amazing and effervescent Katya Iverson, who is leading us on Women Deliver and really paving a way forward as we think about things. What we'd love to do today is give you some of the key data and facts from our findings, which give a more concrete sense of some of the things that we are experiencing at work around the globe. And I'd also like to turn it over to Katya to say a few words, because we work together on this in spirit of partnership and in spirit of discovering solutions together that will inform the conference. So we'll give a little bit of an introduction, open it up for questions, and look forward to the discussion. Katya.
Thank you very much, and good morning. What a beautiful day it is today as well. So at Women Deliver, we are advocates. We're global advocates for gender equality and for women's health and rights. And to be that, we need good arguments, strong arguments. We need evidence. We need cases. We need data. And working with institutes and organizations like the McKinsey Global Institute to really develop that is such a treat for us as advocates, but it's also what can fuel that advocacy and fuel the progress in the world. There are so many interlinkages when we talk about gender equality that needs to be in place to make the vision a reality. And economic participation and financial independence is a critical component. So thank you to McKinsey for taking the lead on this research and discussing with us along the way. The report shows that automation is likely to increase the barriers that are already holding women back in low-paid jobs or trapped in the informal economy. But it also shows that there's a lot of potential. So as we move towards the future of work, we really need to step it up if we don't want to leave half the population behind, if we want individuals, societies, and economies to thrive. I'm an impatient optimist, so it's good to see that there's hope, but it's also very evident that action needs to be taken. So we appreciate the report and you launching it at Women Deliver during the conference here. And the important new data will really help fuel the discussion, not only here, but way beyond, in countries, but also globally. And we can use it as we use many of your studies in our advocacy moving forward. We know women in the workforce are a strength. We know that when women fully participate in business, when they're not relegated to the lower ranks of the workforce, companies are more profitable and resilient. And we often cite the McKinsey Parity report that if women participated in the economy at the same level of men, it would add as much as 28 trillion or 26% to global GDP by 2025. I think we need to step it up by making it by 2025, but maybe else we'll look at the new study coming out on that. Those figures were based on the upwards trajectory of gender equality, but we also see some stagnation there. So we need to invest politically, programmatically and financially in girls and women so that the automation continues to move us forward and not backwards in a gender equal spirit. So the private sector in general has a tremendous role to play. Business has the power to move the world towards a gender equal place, starting with women's economic empowerment, and it's good for both business and for women and for society at large. So our role is to continue advocating for the investment in girls and women and gender equality, improved laws, policies that support women in the emerging workforce, and then of course also push the envelope with the private sector. So we'll continue to work together and develop more evidence, new evidence that can be used throughout the world to make that change happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja. We're very excited to share the findings of our new report, The Future of Women at Work, Transitions in an Age of Automation. It's available online and in the back of the room as well. The report builds on our Power of Parity research, which was released 4 years ago, where we looked at the economic opportunity of women participating in a more equal way to men in the overall economy. And Katja mentioned the $28 trillion. That's actually the size of the economy of the US and China put together, added to the global economy. But that wasn't realistic, and so we wanted to look in that report at a more realistic scenario. And so we matched the best rate of improvement region by region around the world. So in Western Europe, matching the best rate of improvement of Spain as an example. And that gets us to about 40% of the total opportunity. That's $12 trillion, that's trillion with a T, and it's equal to the size of the economies of Japan, UK, and Germany added to global GDP. It's a really big deal. We also looked in the Power of Parity report at not just equality in work, but also equality in society, and that correlation between the two, because the societal gaps that were holding women back were the very thing that were stopping countries from capturing their share of that economic opportunity. We also looked at a gender parity score between 0 and 1 being perfect equality, 0 being perfect inequality, to measure that equality and progress over time. What we found now, that report was released 4 years ago, we've just updated all of the data and the insights, and unfortunately the progress has been shockingly slow. Basically the gender parity score that I was describing has budged by 0.1% or so, or 0.1 or 1% or so. So basically we're pretty much at the same place we were before. Progress in terms of gender equality in work, as well as gender equality in society, has been very, very slow moving with almost no progress. And against this backdrop of very, very slow progress in work and society, we now have a new challenge for women and for men. We have automation, which is disrupting work today and the future of work as we know it, changing jobs fundamentally and the nature of the work that's done, and changing jobs of the future. In some cases, automating away the more repetitive, rote work that's happening in jobs and requiring a higher level of education in the future for more complex, more sort of emotionally oriented jobs and work in the nature of work. But before we look at the potential of automation to change jobs both now and in the future, it's worth noting that jobs today around the world are highly gendered, and this is true both in mature economies and emerging economies. So for example, women make up over 70% of workers in healthcare and social assistance, but less than 25% of machine operators. And those patterns are true across the world. We looked at, in this research, we looked at 10 countries around the world, 6 mature economies and 4 emerging economies. Together, those 10 countries accounted for over 60% of global GDP and over 50% of the global population. Because of those different footprints and different starting places that women and men have in occupations, the impact that automation has on women and men is quite different. It's highly gendered and particularly concentrated in some occupations. And when we look at both jobs gained, the report looked at both, 20% of working women could have their jobs taken away and affected by automation. That's roughly the same percentage as men. About 21% of jobs of men will be affected by automation. That's the jobs loss piece. There's also the jobs gained element, which comes from increased investment, increased consumption, changes in demographic trends, so an aging population with greater demand for healthcare, for instance. And the jobs gain picture is actually quite similar to the jobs loss picture, and they almost net each other out. In terms of jobs gained, about 20% of jobs will be created from this greater investment, greater consumption demographic changes for women, and about 19% for men. So very similar patterns, but how that plays out occupation by occupation is quite different. In addition to those jobs lost and jobs gained, we also have new categories of jobs, what we call frontier jobs, that will be created. Well, in fact, 1 in 10 jobs could be in new categories. So things like machine learning analysts or environmentally friendly or social media managers, for instance. Jobs that even 10, 20 years ago we couldn't have imagined, but now are entire job categories. Unfortunately, those types of frontier jobs have historically been dominated by men. So about 60% of those frontier jobs in the United States have historically been taken by men. In the future, though, it's open and fair game, and you could imagine women having some of those jobs as well, or a fair share of those jobs. If you look beyond the aggregate figures of the jobs lost and jobs gained, the composition, occupation by occupation, is quite different, as I mentioned. So service-oriented and clerical support jobs are accounting for over 50% of the jobs lost by women. So automated checkout, AI, and assistants, automated assistants, for instance, are driving a lot of the jobs lost for women. Machine operators and craft occupations are driving about 40% of the jobs lost for men. So quite different industries that are affected. In terms of the jobs gained, healthcare could account for 25% of the jobs gained for women, and manufacturing is going to account for 25% of the jobs gained for men. So again, very different occupation by occupation.
So Quaylen gave you a picture of what jobs could be displaced by automation, and then also potential for jobs to be gained as economies grow, as demographics shift, as governments and companies make investments. But this future of job displacement and job opportunities, it's not a given. It will require huge job transitions, both for men and for women. And that's something we tried to unpack a little bit in this research. So what does that job transition look like? What we found was that when we look at women, 40 to 160 million women may need to switch occupations by 2030 globally. Let's try and dimensionalize that. That's essentially 1 in 4 women that will need to switch occupations by 2030. So huge job transitions potentially happening in the labor market to actually capitalize on some of the opportunities for job creation and job gains that Quaylen described. And by the way, that number is similar for men as well. About 1 in 4 men, up to 1 in 4 men may need to transition. And so looking at that, one may say that the future of work actually has a similar impact on both men and women. And in some sense, that is true. So men and women can be described, a metaphor we use to describe it is that men and women may be running the same race. But it's important to remember that women are running that race with a weight around their ankle. So all the historical issues that women have faced in gender equality in society, as well as gender equality in the workplace, may impact their ability to capitalize and capture these new opportunities. And so the race may be the same, but for the runners in the race, the reality could be quite different. And so I want you to hold on to that, and Lorena will come back to that point about the weight around the ankles and what we need to do to support women in a few minutes. But before we go to that, let's talk about the prize. Why do we care about this at all? So one of the things we looked at was to say, if we look at the jobs of the future, what do they mean in terms of their wages, their productivity, how fulfilling these jobs are? And essentially what we found was that across both mature and emerging economies, these jobs of the future, provided men and women can capture them, tend to be higher wage jobs, they tend to be more productive jobs, and in many cases also potentially more fulfilling jobs. So if you imagine a nurse in the future in a hospital, she can now spend less time, say, doing data entry and use some of that free time to interact with patients. So the nature of work could look quite different and in a sense could be spent more in tasks that are fulfilling for workers. So there's one future that you could imagine where women and men are able to make these transitions, and that leads to a world of more productive, higher wage, more fulfilling jobs, in many countries we find that the female share of employment could rise as well. There's another future you could imagine where women don't make such transitions. And in that future, what we find is that women could be stuck in low-wage employment. In many cases, there could be competition for low-wage jobs. Wages could fall, and as a result, women in particular could be forced out of the labor market, could choose to step out of the labor market because job opportunities are not available to them. And in that scenario, all the hard-fought gains we've made in the past towards gender equality could be lost. So there's a huge prize, but there's also a huge downside risk. And so the question becomes, how do we ensure that we navigate these transitions successfully and ensure that both women and men are equipped to take advantage of the opportunities of the future? So let's understand a little bit what they need to be able to make the transition. So I'm going to talk about skills in particular, because I think that's one of the most important things that people will need in the jobs of the future. So we looked at these future jobs and tried to understand what do they look like in terms of the educational attainment that workers will need for these jobs. And what we found was that across, again, both mature and emerging economies, it's the jobs that require a higher education. So in advanced economies, it's jobs that require college or advanced degrees. In emerging markets, it's jobs that require a secondary education. These are the jobs that are likely to grow. In mature economies, in fact, jobs that require lower than a college or advanced degree are likely to shrink. In countries like India, jobs that require low skills, jobs in subsistence agriculture, for example, are likely to shrink. So there's going to be a bias in the jobs of the future towards more skills. There's also going to be a bias towards a whole different set of skills. So going back to my nurse example, the nurse is spending less time doing data entry, and as a result, essentially the skills required with basic cognitive tasks, skills associated with physical and manual labor, these are all likely to shrink. The need for such skills is likely to shrink. And instead, we're going to see three other categories of skill needs rise. The first is around socio and emotional skills, as Quaylen alluded to. The second is around technical skills, and that's not just being coders, but just using and working with technology more and more. And then the third is skills related to higher cognitive thinking, creativity, entrepreneurship, leadership. And so we're going to see a workforce of the future that is not only going to require more skills, but is going to require a different set of skills. And so the question becomes, how do we actually equip the workforce of the future to capture these opportunities, and how do we tackle the specific barriers that women face? So before we talk about that with the global report, which Lorena will do in a few minutes, I wanted to hand over to Jen, who's going to talk specifically about some of our insights on Canada.
Thank you. We are very excited to be launching our report during this amazing conference. As of this morning, you can find it online on our website, mckinsey.com/Women Matter Canada 2019. This report builds on our 2017 report and is looking at, we interviewed over 110 companies, headquarter organizations in Canada, that covers more than 500,000 of employees across 20 industries, with small, medium, and large businesses that would range from having employees of about 50 to 90,000 people. What's very specific about this report is it looks at how automation could impact the jobs by gender in depth, by occupation, and by sector in the future. So in the age of automation, Canada finds itself at a crossroad on the journey to gender equality. With amplified efforts, women could thrive, but with inaction, women could fall further behind. This is let me talk about some of the specifics of the report. The first chapter talks about the commitment to gender equality, and the good news is that the commitment of Canadian organizations is stronger than ever. But we still have a leaky pipeline, and there are still some significant barriers. The good news is 80% of the Canadian companies that we interviewed considered gender diversity as a priority. And half of them have actually articulated a very strong business case for gender diversity. This is a threefold increase, by the way, from our 2017 report. However, the talent pipeline dwindles from equal representation at the entry level falling to 31% at the VP level and 14% at the CEO level. So for every 3 women that get promoted to the VP level, 5 men receive the promotion. Almost 60% of the women reported having experienced some form of microaggression at work. So compared to men in VP roles, females are 5 times more likely to have to prove their competency and 3 times more likely to be addressed in a less than professional manner. The second is the future of the Canadian economy and the age of automation could hold opportunities for women, but to capture them requires successful workforce reskilling and transition, as was just previously mentioned. So 24% of the women today could be at risk of losing their jobs or being displaced by automation, compared to 28% for men. Women, though, could be very well positioned to capture net new jobs in sectors such as healthcare, where 80% of the women in Canada hold those positions. If between 8 to 30% of women, which represents about 1 to 3 million women in Canada, can successfully transition to higher wage, higher skilled jobs in the new economy, they could maintain or modestly increase their share of employment by 1 to 2 percentage points by 2023. However, women could face more hurdles in navigating through the transition. So, such as the burden of unpaid work, which, by the way, women do twice the amount of that work as men. The skills gap in STEM, where we see that today 1 in 4 STEM jobs are occupied by women, and the existing wage gaps that still persists, where women earn 87 for every dollar that men earn today in Canada. Organizations need to act now and to tackle the challenges of today and tomorrow and accelerate their progress towards gender equality. So the organization need to adopt a holistic ecosystem approach of persistence, like to drive change and specific actions around that. In particular, measuring, tracking, and holding people accountable are the keys to success. Our survey results show that only half of the organizations set numeric targets towards looking by gender, and less than 40% hold their seniors accountable for those targets. The journey to gender equality is the same thing as any sort of business transformation, so whatever gets measured gets done. Finally, organization will need to design specific interventions around workforce reskilling, transition to women's unique needs and challenges in mind, looking at focusing on transparency of the future of employment, and having inclusive reskilling, recruiting activities, and leveling the playing field in technology. So we're very excited about this report, and we'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have later.
So just to sum it up, there are 2 reports. One looks globally at the future of work and the impact of automation on women. And the second report is a deep dive on Canada that takes a look at how automation affects jobs, but also the corporate workplace and what are some of the solutions. What's very exciting, and we shared a lot of data with you, so if you were scribbling it down very rapidly, thank you. But I think if you were just to step back and say, what are some of the data highlights of what was just mentioned? To put it in perspective globally, 1 out of 4 women by 2030 will see their job significantly transformed. Displaced, their job may be here, it may be so much change that it's unrecognizable. That's 1 in 4. So if you look around the room, that is a remarkable number of people. Now, if we look at that, the size of the impact, as Quaylen was saying, is about the same for men and women. However, as Quaylen and Mekhala was saying, that because the jobs that women have today are different, the way in which we support women to find the next generation of opportunities or to remain in their jobs but be more relevant in their jobs today as they transform is different. And that's what we were calling a gendered workplace that requires gendered solutions. And we're going to need safeguards, because if we think about the impact of women at work, the $12 trillion that Quaylen mentioned, You would hate to actually take a step back because of automation. You'd want to take a step forward towards harnessing that opportunity. And so that's probably leading you all to think about, and Katya, we've talked about this a lot, what are the solutions? And where we sit today is we are at a fork in the road. What the data shows is one, as Mekhala said, a scenario of great opportunity and promise, and one that doesn't look as good. Let's focus on the positive one. In order to reach the positive scenario, there are a couple of things that we're going to have to do differently as we consider the solution sets and actions. The first one is that we're going to have to create digital equity. Today, just as a fact, men have 33% more access to the internet than women globally. The internet is your portal to the digital access, the digital skills that you need, the types of reskilling programs that are delivered both in person and digitally. It is the sort of entry card, and we're already starting a step behind. So that's one place. The second one is we need to figure out how to share the load. There's been a lot of discussion that's already happened at the conference and will continue to happen at the Women Deliver conference this week around sharing the load. And what do I mean by that? Because women work the official hours from, say, 9 to 5, then they go home to the unpaid economy, the home care economy. Let me describe what that is worth. That's 1.1 trillion hours of unpaid work globally. Every woman spends 3 times as many hours in that economy than men. So that's what we call the double shift. And that's what we also call sharing the load. Because if we're going to help women to gain the skills and capabilities for the incredibly exciting jobs in the positive scenario and that are going to materialize, they need to create the time. Their third job will be finding the time to get those skills after they finish their first job, their second job. So we just have to consider, how do we meet them where they are versus expect that they are going to meet us. The next thing is that because of a gendered workplace today, in terms of the composition of jobs that women have, healthcare has been mentioned a lot as examples. The type of skills that are required are different. And we need to be sophisticated in our programs to make sure that we're building the right skills for men and women. And if we just kind of fall on the familiarity bias towards the jobs that we see for men, we may miss the generation of women and the specific type of skills that they need. And the other thing is we need to create a safe workplace. One of the things that you'll find in the report, which I encourage you to take a look at, is that the workplace is not as safe as we would like in terms of the commutes between your home to your work and then the actual workplace itself, anything from harassment to physical abuse. And this is not something that is a developing market challenge. It's a developed and a developing market challenge shared across all the countries that we looked at. So these are some of the types of solution areas that we have to take a look at, and that's why it's so important to think of as you consider what actions you would take. Some people say, well, do we need to act now? It's 10 years from now, and maybe automation won't grow as quickly, or maybe it'll be slower. But if you think about the challenge of reskilling, it doesn't happen in a day, it doesn't happen in a month. It happens over time. So that's why we think that we need to start now. I would just say that on the face of optimism, I think we're all very optimistic people, and Katya has to go in a second. We are looking at new jobs, higher wages, more innovation, and a better quality of work. And I think what we're all focused on is how do we find the facts that help us build the programs to help women get there. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I have to go, but please do stay.
And that's a perfect transition to, we'd be happy to answer any questions you have on the report. Yes.
Did you do, on the global report, a country-by-country breakdown or any kind of look at which countries might be most and least affected in terms of the automation of work?
Absolutely. Quillen, do you want to talk about the 10 countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked at 10 countries, and then I'll let Mekhala describe some of the country-by-country view. 6 mature economies, as we described, and then the 4 emerging ones. The 6 mature ones were the US, UK, Japan, France, Germany, and Canada. And then the emerging economies were China, India, Mexico, and South Africa.
Yeah, I can talk you can, in the report, find more detailed data across the 10 countries, but I would say the 3 things that stood out to me looking across countries. I think number one, when we look at automation, we have our analysis not just looks at the technical potential for automation, but also whether it's economically viable or not. And what that means is that mature economies tend to have a higher share of jobs at risk of automation compared to emerging economies, just because wages are much higher in developed economies. So the economic and business case for investing in automation tends to be more relevant for mature economies than emerging markets. So that's number one. The second, perhaps surprisingly for us, at first, was that the relative impact on men and women tends to be, again, roughly the same whether you look at emerging or mature economies. So Quaylen talked about that global number of about 20% versus 19%, or 20% versus 21% when we look at jobs lost or jobs gained. And that, 1 percentage point or so spread, we typically see that across both emerging and mature economies. And the reason for that goes back to the fact that across countries, the workforce tends to be gendered in quite similar ways, right? So the sectors that women tend to be in, the sectors that men tend to be in, look roughly the same across countries, and as a result, the relative impact for men and women is roughly the same across countries. So that's the second. I think the third, so I come from India, the third finding, which was actually quite worrisome for me, looking at our data, was how rural agrarian-based economies, how much women in those economies could be particularly impacted. So in India, for example, about 60% of women are employed in agriculture, and that is a sector which, even in the traditional path of development, will shrink as more agriculture gets mechanized, and possibly the rate at which that happens going forward will be even faster. And so what do we do to think about women in such economies, and how do we think about skilling them? Because the skills that they possess tend to be not the skills of the jobs of the future. And then we have this challenge of geography as well, right? They are in rural parts of India, for example. So how do we ensure that the skilling programs reach them, and how do we ensure that the job opportunities reach them? So I think that finding for us was relevant for India, but you could imagine a similar challenge in other parts of the world that have similar economical structures.
Hello, I have a question about parental leaves policy. What would you recommend to developing countries, and how does it affect jobs gain and jobs loss? For example, in Uzbekistan, where I come from, parental leave payments are on employers' responsibility, and this leads us to the tendency when companies are not willing to hire young women because they think they're going to get married soon and have kids. Thank you.
On parental leave, the report didn't specifically look at parental leave. What we've seen more broadly around the world is large variation in terms of parental leave, both for mothers and for fathers, and actually a relationship where above a certain point, so beyond sort of 1 year, 2 years of parental leave, we actually see decreasing labor force participation of women. But I think at the levels that you're describing, either at no parental leave or very low parental leave, we do see significant benefits from that.
I think the other point I would add to that, and you alluded to this in passing, and I think it's an important point, so I just wanted to emphasize it, is, parental leave is very important for a certain duration in a person's life, obviously when the children are young. But I think the bigger challenge for me, or what it underscores, is really the broader point about family versus work responsibilities, and how we think about the broader balancing between paid and unpaid work. So I think parental leave is a very important part of that conversation, but I think there's a bigger conversation as well about social norms and how do we help men and women balance paid and unpaid work effectively, so that both men and women have the time for reskilling, they have the time to find new forms of employment, and they have the time to have fulfilling lives. So I think you mentioned that in passing, but it's a very important point.
The last thing that I would say, building on that, in Canada, we have a pretty robust set of policies and benefits. That being said, what's important sort of moving forward is to create a conversation and a collaboration between the government and the industry in order to really understand, what would be the best policies and benefits to be put in place in order to capture the opportunity that automation does occur. So I think it is ever changing, and it does require that dialogue between the government and the industry.
Hi, Rachel Pulford, journalist for Human Rights. Fascinating findings, thank you so much. Wondering if you, from these findings, have surfaced any either policy recommendations for governments or recommendations for programming action from INGOs, many of whom are represented here.
Yeah, I'll start, and others please chime in. Yeah, we would, and Lorena, you described a bit of this. We think it's really important that the solutions for reskilling have a strong gender lens, given how gendered the work itself is, and also take into account the challenges that women are going to face in that reskilling. So elements of the actual skills they'll need for the jobs of the future, that physical mobility, and you described the safety elements, Lorena, but both feeling safe in that transportation, but also just having access to that transportation. And then also the technological access or tech skills and savviness that's going to be required. With those three elements, I think both governments, NGOs, companies, a number of companies are also investing deeply in reskilling. I think those are the elements that are going to shape very successful programs of the future. So for instance, a reskilling program that is focused on clerical support workers or assistants, for example, if it doesn't provide, for instance, childcare at that reskilling program and transportation to the reskilling program itself that is safe, that's not going to have the strong enough gender lens to be effective, given the 1 in 4 women who are going to need to change occupations.
And I think that one of the things that's very promising is you're starting to see some really creative collaborations between very large Fortune 500 companies, global companies, and different nonprofit digital platforms. So you see edX, you see Coursera, and you see all these different platforms starting to collaborate with the private sector to provide access to the types of skills. And if you can imagine that if you have access to the internet, if you have basic digital literacy, so those two ifs need to be in place, you could actually do some of the courses in your own time. And I think that the bigger point is the collaboration across the nonprofit sector and the private sector and with the policymakers and government could be an unlock. Because right now, a lot of the programs are probably at a small level of scale. So very successful for 100, 1,000 women. By the way, that's fantastic. Those are terrific results. But at the scale of the challenge of automation, we're going to need that in the millions.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Hi. I want to know if you have some information about African women and in general about women from minority.
Actually, in a couple of months, we have a new report focused on Africa. It's the global power of parity work that I was describing, but an Africa-specific deep dive that will be released in a couple of months. So stay tuned, and we're very excited to release that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming, especially quite early in the morning, and we appreciate your time, and we look forward to more questions. And if some people are joining on the live stream, feel free to reach out to us directly if there are questions or points for clarification. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.